Danteen, you want the Australian Air Force to participate in bombing Islamic State inside Syria, not just Iraq. What possible difference could that make?
Well, in my view, it can make a difference to Daesh's activity in Syria, and I think it's important that we do everything we can to try and address the humanitarian crisis in Syria, as well as defend our own national security interests, because at the moment Syria, or the eastern part of Syria, which has formed the caliphate, is acting as a beacon for foreign fighters, including from foreign fighters from Australia.
But what could our participation do that American bombing isn't already doing?
Well, what it does, it clearly demonstrates that we are prepared to act, not only alone in Iraq, in Syria, and what that will show is that we are serious when it comes to us calling for greater action by the world in terms of addressing what is occurring currently in Syria. We have to be able to be prepared to say we're prepared to act, but we are calling on the international community to do more. And the international community needs to do more. That's just not coming from me, that's coming from the UN Secretary General.
So the logic behind your call, the effect of Australian participation, isn't so much about what it would do on the ground, it's about gathering international unity on this issue?
Well, it's both. I think we've got to be prepared to help, and we've got to be able to demonstrate that we can help, but also, more importantly, when it comes to Syria, we've got to get greater international cooperation in dealing with the current situation in Syria. We're not going to be able to fix Syria on our own. This is something that the international community needs to act on. And there are many compelling reasons, but I'll give you one. When it came to Kosovo, the world acted when 230,000 people had been displaced. In Syria now, 230,000 people have lost their lives. 9 million people have been displaced.
But in Kosovo and, say, in Iraq now, it's very clear. In Iraq, Australia supports the government against IS. In Syria, it's far more complicated.
Yep.
Is it time that the international community and Australia came to terms with the government of Bashar al-Assad, because it's the lesser of two evils?
The way it's been described to me is fixing Syria is like playing and trying to win a three-dimensional chess game. There are many moving pieces, there are many competing interests. So the only way that you will solve it is by getting the international community together and properly cooperating. Now, the question of what to do with Assad is one of those questions that needs to be addressed, but it's only one of the questions that needs to be addressed.
So bombing isn't the solution, it's a step towards a larger solution.
Well, it is part of the solution. Obviously, you've got to defeat ultimately Daesh on the ground, but there is also a broader strategy that needs to be put in place.
If you're going to defeat it on the ground, that means troops inside Syria.
Well, this is something that the United Nations needs to think long and hard about. Okay, what are we going to do about it?
Do we need to think about that? Troops on the ground in Iraq and in Syria?
Well, Chris, let's not get ahead of ourselves here. It's all very
well. Why not? I mean,
no, because we're all just trying to get a headline here about whether there is we should put boots on the ground or not. Let's go back a step. Let's just see what the current situation is. UN Secretary General saying this is a humanitarian crisis which words cannot describe. Right, 9 million people displaced. We have not seen a humanitarian crisis like this. 83% of Syrian lights have gone out in the last for 4 years. No, hear me out. 83% of lights in Syria have gone out in the last 4 years. That's homes, that's hospitals, that's schools. What I'm saying is, let's do our little bit. Let's join the Ally campaign in Syria. Right, then let's get the United Nations Security Council to have a proper discussion and get a proper strategy in place to deal with this issue.
You've described the situation in Syria yourself as a three-dimensional chess game. You suggested putting some bombing into that chess game. When I ask you about what happens next, you say, let's do it one step at a time. But in chess, it's never one step at a time. You have to look forward. So is bombing the first step, or does it necessarily lead, if, as you say, you want to defeat Daesh on the ground, to greater intervention?
Well, that is something that, in my view, that the United Nations needs to sit down, and especially the Security Council needs to sit down and work out. They need to put a proper strategy in place. Now, if you look at what we're doing in Iraq, we do have military advisors on the ground trying to help the Iraqi forces. Now, should we consider doing more of that in Syria? That is definitely a question that needs to be asked, but it needs to be asked by the international community. And we have to, what form would any type of intervention take? That's the type of questions that we now have to be asking seriously. Now, this isn't something that Australia can do alone, but it's something that we can help drive, getting the United Nations and especially the Security Council to take this seriously.
So that's a debate we should be having in Australia, what more we can do to combat Daesh inside Syria, not just discussing bombing, as you've suggested, but other things as well.
Well, I've suggested my strategy is very much a two-course strategy. One is let's show that we're prepared to act, and secondly, let's especially call on the US as one of our key allies in this to show leadership, to go to the United Nations with our support and say, OK, let's try and get a proper strategy in place to deal with this global humanitarian crisis.
OK, Dan Tehan, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Chris.